All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Kathy Joseph from Fiddlehead Cellars. It's April 8th, 2021. Kathy's joining us via Zoom, and Tia Elder is also here on the Zoom with us. Kathy, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate this. Let's start with the most important question, which is why wine?
Well, it wasn't my plan early on. I was extremely studious as a kid. And I learned early on that I was great at science, and I loved science, and I loved exploring the field. And I had a great family friend who actually helped me see the path to science as being an art form. And that it wasn't angular and strictly black and white, but that there were lots of decisions that you made along the way and lots of room for differing opinions and personalities. And it was exciting to kind of think that I could be a real person and be involved in the scientific world. And the first thought was that medicine was a great way to go, but I was always questioning myself. And so my college career was based more on diversifying within the sciences. So I grew up in the Midwest outside of Chicago, in Evanston, home of Northwestern University. And then I went to college not far away, but to Madison, Wisconsin. And I actually thought you're supposed to go to college to learn what you didn't know. And I studied a liberal arts program that I was disenchanted with and dropped out and worked at Crate and Barrel, which I loved, the selling aspect there. I mean, it was like fantastic. And then went back to work in sciences and, were loaded up with physics and P-Chem and biochem and lots of labs. So I was up early and stayed up late. And I worked so hard that I was afraid that if I headed into the medical world that I would miss out on a certain socializing aspect that I felt was important in my life. But I armed myself with courses so I could move into soil science or food science or really any kind of science, flavor science, or and little did I know that wine was a field of study at the time. And my dad pointed out to me, hey, there's this place, out in California, a school where you can learn about enology and viticulture. And I remember saying, oh, Dad, I want a real job. And, I felt that was just too easy. And, I wanted to be practical about my kind of, what I was going to do next in life. And I decided that if I was going to get involved in the wine world, that I wanted to incorporate hands-on activity with the educational aspect, which I strongly believed in. And so I actually took a job out in Sonoma at Simi Winery when Zelma Long was there, and wanted to just see what it was like. It turned out the position was actually in a closed tasting room where I did VIP tours, but it was being in this environment that I found to be fascinating. And I had simultaneously applied to graduate school at Davis. It was this early interaction with Zelma Long that I attribute to expanding to really thinking outside the box and teaching me the importance of taste and how you taste and how sugar and acid characters in a beverage interact with each other. And, I just gobbled this stuff up. And I actually became, an expert to teach the people who were coming as visitors. So I did a lot of reading and a lot of meeting with her team. Ultimately, was accepted to the graduate school at Davis, and I was studying under Corneo. I never graduated, mostly because I started working in the industry and loved it so much that I couldn't find purpose in wanting to finish my research project, which was very, very interesting. But I was working by that time at very small wineries that were, almost 24/7 jobs. And I didn't mind that, but it kind of pulled me a little away from the school aspect. But going to Davis, I learned a wealth of information, but most importantly, I learned how to apply my biochemistry and microbiology to the wine world. It was a very easy segue for me. I kind of like that. I found it fascinating. And what I was researching at Davis was yeast nutrition. And we were looking at biotin deficiencies and H2S formation, and it was pretty interesting stuff. But every fall, I took off and worked at a different local winery so that I could get that hands-on connection. So after CME, I worked at Joseph Phelps in St. Helena, and I was predominantly working in the cellar there. And it was great. It was with these guys who had worked there for, 10 and 15 years. So it was mostly men, but I, had no problem with, learning how to drive the forklift and learning how to hook up a pump and which pump to use and making wine with walkie-talkies. And it was guys in the trenches, which was really fantastic. But at the same time, I became very good friends with the winemaker and assistant winemaker and laboratory person. So I was involved in some of the things. And, I loved that part too. So I really felt like I was taken under the wing of, so Walter Shug was there and Craig Williams was there, and it was just a great family. Let's see, then I think I moved on to Long Vineyards, which was a very small property who outside of St. Helena also. And I worked a lot, not only in the vineyards, learning how to sample fruit, but I learned how to set up a laboratory and then work at a winery on a very small scale. So tasting barrels. And so Zelma was the consulting winemaker at that time. And so we would sit down and discuss the plan for harvest and tasting some of the barrels and about cross-contamination, just very practical things that I found incredibly interesting. And through that position, I was introduced to Bob Long's best buddy, Bob Pacoda, who had a small winery up in Calistoga. And, he was kind of like me, an ambitious, think outside the box winemaker that never had enough money or enough personnel. And he loved having people like me who just wanted to be a sponge and soak up everything. And so he was, quite brilliant at business. And he gave me incredible opportunities at a very, very young stage of my life. And so I participated from day one in everything, which including developing winemaking styles and expanding the program on varietals that we were making. I became the winemaker and consulting winemaker to all the growers that we custom crushed for. I tasted on panels for competitions for 15 years. And, you know, good for me when he was going through a divorce, I was kind of thrown out into the field to learn marketing. And it's not necessarily something you know how to do, even if you take a marketing class, to communicate to distributors, to talk pricing, to develop style and finesse, to learn what to wear at what time, how to conduct yourself at wine dinners. I mean, I was doing this when I was quite young, and it was exciting to me. So I loved what I did every minute of the day. I loved the diversity. And I had a lot of teachers in different aspects. So I was truly staged to set up my own winery. And one of the other things that kind of helped me focus on a direction was back in '86 when I was traveling for Pacoda. I bumped into Stephen Carey, who at that time, you know, was owner of Carey Oregon Wines, and essentially representing Oregon wineries around the world. And, you know, he was a interesting guy, but he loved sharing the importance of Oregon wines and the diversity of Oregon wines. And more importantly than falling in love with Oregon wines, I fell in love with Pinot Noir. And so I was in a position to taste a lot of wines. And when I worked at Pacoda, made one very bad Pinot Noir, but it was such a great learning ground. And I learned that you don't make Pinot Noir like Cabernet. And you use different tanks, you taste and pick differently, you mix the vats differently. And to make a bad Pinot on someone else's time, you know, what better education was there? And it was great fruit. It was Carneros fruit from a great vineyard. But I learned my lessons very quickly. And I, at some point in my life, felt that I had peaked at what I could gain from Pacoda and felt that it was time to focus. And, you know, I did something many new young winemakers don't do, which is I wrote a business plan. And I interviewed all the people I knew who were in business. I read a lot of books. I took a couple of courses. I tried to figure it out. And, you know, I did giant projections on my Apple IIe computer. You know, it had dot matrix paper. It was piles and piles. And ultimately I carried it to a CPA and I said, you know, I can't integrate it, you know, the years. And, but in 1988 is when I was planning what I was going to be doing for the future. And I decided that I would be a small winery, and my projections gave me lots of flexibility. But I first decided what I wanted to make. And so I decided I needed to do something differently from the other wineries I had been working for. And so I knew I had to create my niche. And that niche was going to be Pinot Noir and Sauvignon Blanc, because I felt that they were amazing partners in a textural standpoint from a worldwide perspective, not necessarily how we were making those wines domestically, but the elegance that could be created in both wines. But also they were underdog varietals at the time that I got started. And there were grapes grown in the wrong places. There was the wrong equipment that was being used. But I felt that I was on a quest to find areas where I could make my mark. And I didn't have a huge pouch of family money. I didn't, you know, I needed to be, I wanted to go to the right places. I knew my wines needed to be place driven. and I wanted to make wines that were respectful of the place, but I needed to create some diversity, and yet I wanted focus at the same time so that I could get really good at what I was doing. So the business plan included making Pinot Noir not just in California and not just in Oregon, but to simultaneously make Pinot Noir in both places, because I had tasted enough wines from wineries that I really felt the potential was extreme. There was lots of bad wine out there, but there was, you had to find enough that you could really, really believe in. And I didn't, by working in 2 states, you're a little less blinded by your immediate environment. I felt that I really, I don't know, I think I was more discriminating about what I could really do successfully. And so I didn't want to diversify by working with the vineyard down the street or even in the adjacent appellation, but that I could accomplish working with Pinot Noir in 2 different states, where in Oregon, in general, the harvest or vintage started about a month later. And I was very adamant that I needed to be on site to be successful making my wines. And so for 15 vintages, I actually first worked in Santa Barbara County, and then I relocated up to the Willamette Valley, and then, managed my entire year commuting between the 2 places. And fortunately, I had a home in Davis, which became kind of a halfway point. I could manage an office there, but also I could stay connected to a lot of my North Coast friends for resources. Sonoma, Alexander Valley, they great resources of information. How do you do something? Who would you recommend? What has been your approach to solving a problem? Or I mean, it was fantastic. And I continued to taste in a wine group in Napa with college friends for many years to come. But I didn't want to make just Pinot Noir. So the way I diversified was to work with Sauvignon Blanc. And Santa Barbara County offered this very unique geography that has a transverse valley where the mountain ranges were turned by shifting plate tectonics millions of years ago. And so in a very geographically small area, we had a definition of a very cool climate, but 30 miles away was a significantly warmer climate, like 30 degrees warmer. And the excitement additionally was that it wasn't just warm, but it had access to fog that would roll over the hills because of the unique coastline of Southern California. So where we are, we actually have water to the west and water to the south. And so this is, when I started working in the area, it was way before we had sub-appellations, but Santa Ynez Valley and Santa Maria Valley were the 2 appellations. And then since Santa Ynez Valley has been defined further by Santa Rita Hills and Ballard Canyon and Los Olivos district and Happy Canyon, which is where my Sauvignon Blanc came from, the more easterly district. Just to mention, fast forwarding, or let me back up a little bit about the business plan. Didn't know where I would end up because it was all based on how much money I could raise. And so I wrote a business plan to be a 3,000 case winery where I would custom crush at someone else's facility, or a 6,000 case winery where I would custom crush at someone's facility, or a 6,000 case winery where I own the winery. And then each of those renditions included a vineyard aspect where I would own a vineyard or not own a vineyard. And so it was a lot of scenarios that was more or less based on my financial ability. So I started small, 3,000 case winery, where I custom crushed both in Oregon and in California. And then I ended up being a 6,000 case winery where I operate in leased facility. And I own a 100-acre vineyard where the ground was purchased in '96. And I became not only a supplier of my own grapes, but a seller of grapes to other wonderful winemakers. And it enabled me to diversify my portfolio a little bit where, you know, in recent history, I planted Grüner Veltliner as a kind of a third wine that I've been making since 2014. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I do everything. I have a small staff. I'm involved. I live on the property that is now called Fiddlesticks Vineyard in the Santa Rita Hills, located opposite a historic vineyard called Sanford and Benedict Vineyard. I have continuously made Oregon wines from 1991 through 2018, actually. And I actually had a little lull in when I had no access to Santa Barbara Pinot, which is what pushed me into looking to develop my own vineyard. So 2004 to, let's see, it was 1994 to 2000, no, 1994 to 1999. I did not make, I was going to say I didn't make California Pinot, but that's not true. Somewhere in the middle there, I did purchase grapes. So, but the Oregon history, which we should get to, is interesting because I started out working just with Yamhill Valley Vineyard fruit. And that was in 1991, and I made it at Yamhill Valley Vineyards. And I can't recall, I think I might have purchased a ton of fruit, and it reminded me of my old days at Pacoda where I made it all wrong. I borrowed a plastic tank that I punched down probably 3 or 4 or 5 times a day, I'm not sure. But it was such a cold winter that I was allowing the vat to ferment on its own, which actually took about a month. And so though, as you can imagine, the wine was so extracted. It was never released, but it was a phenomenal learning experience. It was really great. I don't regret it at all. It was bottled and labeled and never released. And so 1992, I added in, so 1991, I added in my Oregon production and then my Sauvignon Blanc production. And then in 1992, I added in Seven Springs as a vineyard source. And I wish I have better records because my labels don't tell me, but somewhere between 92 and 99, I additionally was working with Elton fruit and then Canary Hills fruit. It was very exciting. Elton, I was working in the oldest block, which was planted in '83. It was opposite where Ken Wright was getting fruit. And actually he purchased Canary Hills Vineyard, which is when, you know, I totally, or he might have actually scaled up and then purchased it, but it's when I lost access to Canary Hills. So over the early 2000s, I worked with a number of other properties. So it was Elton, Seven Springs, and Yamhill Valley Vineyards for a number of years. And then in 2002, I kind of looked at my records. I worked with Lumen Vineyard. And in 2003, I actually added a Loro and Mumtazi Vineyard. And then, there was just a lot of great experimentation where ultimately in '04, I was backed off to just Elton and Aloro. But it was great because I worked with a lot of Viola Hills fruit. I worked with a lot of growers, organic and non-organic, and biodynamic, of course, with Mumtazi. I made some single barrel selections, both from Elton and Seven Springs from the very early years, like 2000, 2002. I have Elton barrel select, Seven Springs, I have an '01. And I have a great library of wines, so I still taste these to this day. It's really wonderful. But my relationship with Aloro developed when I ran into David Namarnik at a conference at the Steamboat Winemakers Conference, and I loved how the fruit was showing, and his brand was not developed yet at the time. And so I actually started buying exclusively from Aloro probably 2008 forward. And I found lots of overlap in our missions and style and what we do in the vineyard, both sustainably certified, clones that we had planted, the choice of irrigation or not, how we trained and trellised. There was a lot of overlap in philosophy, and so there was a lot of respect. And I think the wines that I made from that property are just gorgeous. The interesting thing, perspective that I'll give is I think it's important to this interview to share with everyone that one of the great things that I think I offered by working in both places was my objectivity. And I didn't get blinded by believing one place was the best or superior. And yet I still wanted to make wines that reflected their roots. And I'm often asked, how do the wines taste differently, or what's the difference? And the history of Santa Barbara County in the North Willamette Valley are somewhat parallel in terms of when the pioneers got started, and soil types and clonal options and clonal research. And I was always excited to really and truly equally promote the virtues and benefits of my Oregon production side by side with where I invested in land, my Santa Rita Hills production. And I never wanted one to overshadow the other. And I think that, of course, you bring in Burgundy and you bring in, down under New Zealand. And I always wanted to talk about Pinot Noir as diversity umbrella of excellence and also trueness to the varietal, and the things that it needed to be, and yet differences, and why I'm always promoting why you don't want to be just drinking one wine from one winemaker from one place, and that to expand one's palate even within the category of Pinot Noir is so rewarding and so exciting that you can have one or two or three open in a given meal and get satisfaction in different ways from each wine, so that a big fat wine isn't the only way to make wine, and a lean tart wine isn't the only way to make wine, but it has to be Pinot Noir and recognizable as Pinot Noir. So that has always been my base philosophy. Maybe you want to ask some questions for me to direction.
I could just sit here and listen to you lecture all day. This is great. I would pay for this class. So, but if I have to ask questions, I can ask questions. I'm curious. You mentioned that people often ask you about best or differences, but I'm curious about you had your education in Davis, you had Willamette Valley, you had the sort of the Southern California. So you're in kind of 3 different wine regions simultaneously there for a long time. Tell me about the differences in the kind of the advancement. You mentioned that the Santa Barbara area and Willamette Valley are kind of similar on their trajectories, but I'm curious about, like, in terms of the science, in terms of the marketing, in terms of the winemaking, or the differences that you were seeing as you're going back and forth between the industries, and what was kind of your initial impression of the Willamette Valley as compared to where you had been before?
So one of the similarities is sort of diversity of agriculture. It's one of the beauties of both areas, and the fact that there can be walnut growers and row crop farmers and vineyards and fruit trees, and I love that diversification. But I always felt that there are differences. Obviously, there's a lot more rainfall up north. The winters are longer and harsher. And sometimes that impacts choices that are made in the vineyard. But I mean, we're all impacted by global warming to a certain degree. And because I felt that flexibility was my mantra a little bit, I always claimed that, Santa Barbara vintages tend to be more predictable because of a more moderate weather pattern. And I felt that what helped me make better Oregon wines every year was to be flexible in my viticulture and winemaking choices, that I didn't always pick at the same time, and I didn't always try to make a certain kind of wine. But in a little year or a cooler year where you picked later, I knew that I would be making a littler wine that maybe I released a little bit later. So my California wine, California has so many wine districts, as does Oregon, but it's really comparing. And now North Willamette Valley has so many subdivisions, and I became very akin to the Chehalem Mountains, but it's kind of like Chehalem Mountains versus Santa Rita Hills. That is really what we're talking about, because California has such diversity that you just cannot generalize any commentary about the wines here, especially Pinot Noir, that's so influenced by where it's grown. But so that's what I'm referring to when I talk to the 2 areas. I feel that maybe there is that consistency out of my Santa Rita Hills wine because of weather, but it doesn't make it better or worse, of course. I think in terms of marketing, I think Oregon has done a hands down much better job. And part of it is the community that rallied together, but also people like David Adelsheim, who, was in the trenches when I was making Oregon wine up in Oregon. And he and others created partnerships with the state and government support that I think has gone a long, long way, and also forged very special overseas relationships. And certainly through IPNC and the Steamboat Conference, I think those gave Oregon marketing probably the leg up. Now, Santa Barbara County has simulated or copied even some of the successes of Oregon, which, heck, it just adds diversity to the community. But I'd say that I'm surrounded more by a lot of wonderful, unique personalities who have a little harder time rallying together, And I would say where Oregon maybe embraced wineries that weren't as fabulous as others in part of the community, I feel it's a little bit more one man for themselves in my community in Santa Barbara County. And so I'd say that marketing has not been as, I would say there's room for improvement is, I guess, what I would say. You have to look things in the right light. It's an extraordinary district. It grows great grapes. My property is so amazing because in extreme vintages, I seem to be a little bit buffered. I am right in the heart of the Santa Rita Hills, but on the Southern Avenue, which is Santa Rosa Road. It's beautiful. It's 10 miles from the ocean. So we get direct ocean breezes every single day. We're cooled by the fog that rolls in the evenings. And the great thing too is that because I sell grapes, I learn from other winemakers who are making wine from my fruit and many who are, I neglected to mention the name of the vineyard is called Fiddlesticks with an X, Fiddlesticks Vineyard. And so, obviously it's on my labels, but it also is on the labels of a lot of other great winemakers. And I haven't sold grapes across state lines, but especially last year where a lot of Napa folks were hit with fires, I expanded my distribution beyond the handful of Napa winemakers I was working with. But it is really a amazing district. What else can I tell you? So you mentioned, well, pandemic wise. I would say agriculture doesn't stop when there's a pandemic. You still gotta farm the fields and you grow the grapes but it is a revolving door on who your customers are going to be and who you can sell to. And part of being a grape grower, you're influenced by years that are big years. The next year people want to buy less, but also, and years when you are affected by natural disasters, you might be able to sell more. I've always embraced selling to both established winemakers and up and coming winemakers because of all the people who kind of gave me my break. And I've never wanted to judge the quality of someone's wine by tasting it, but I judge it by their effort, I think, and their mission and their goals. So I've liked to support that over time. The big differences are really in the winery end. I would say for pandemic, I lost all my national distribution essentially. And most of my wines would end up in white tablecloth restaurants, which closed down for a long period of time and were, some operating to go. Of course, we're licensed to sell wine to go, but that's a small portion. We can do bottles to go. So where that took a huge hit, I would say my direct sales, my online sales, definitely grew. And I was always wondering, where did these people come from and how did they discover Fiddlehead? I mean, I am small And one of my personal challenges has always been to be able to market myself on my short budget. So that, I've had to sort of learn social media myself and learn, just how to promote myself and how to connect with the right people. Of course, we had the local boost of Sideways being filmed here. And to carry that further, I was good friends with the props person. And so Fiddlehead landed in a lot of movies, not just Sideways, but The Kids Are All Right and The Affair and The Sopranos. And more recently, Goliath season 3 was filmed at Fiddlesticks Vineyard. And I still get calls for location shots and also placement. So, I mean, it's pretty cool. That's cool. And it's sort of the personal marketing that I embrace. But, we haven't been able to have events. And so that was always a huge way to spread the word for me. And only recently have we been able to open a tasting patio, which in fact has been good for us because it's about 3 times the size of my tasting room. So I'm trying to make it work for me. I'm always looking for what's the next thing I can add. So now we have music on Sundays, and we have these cool to-go glasses that are sort of logoed with seasonal or event reminders, green for Earth Day, or I don't know, Easter colors, or it's kind of again, trying to think outside the box and do something my neighbors aren't doing. I have to admit that some of my best ideas I steal from other people, but it's not necessarily people in the wine industry. It's when I see a great ad that someone else has done, or a great promotion, or I love something is eye-catching, it helps me design things for myself. So again, I try to be very open about what will help bring me to the next level. So the pandemic, obviously my total gross sales have gone down, but my direct to consumer sales have gone up. I would say, we've probably grown our wine club a little bit, included in our direct to consumer sales. But it's not enough to sustain. I've made a lot more wine than, my business plan was set up on having wholesale distribution. And so I'm trying to convert and also, rebuild that. And I think we all have to know that everyone is not going to be opening up with a very high-end price point, which is, many of my wines, well, I would say my wines aren't in the low-end price point, but some of my barrel select wines were pricier and well worth the value. But we, need to rethink pricing. And sometimes I've offered some great discounts to my consumers that offset the discounts that we would have given to the wholesale to support what they needed to do to distribute the wines. And so I've tried to make it a benefit to everybody.
So I want to back up for a second and talk about marketing, because you've talked about marketing kind of throughout, and I'm curious. You mentioned early lessons learned in marketing, right down to how to market and what to wear. Tell me about some of those lessons and learning to market yourself, and what you kind of gathered from places you had worked and were ready to bring from the beginning of Fiddlehead, and what you had to kind of learn along the way.
So I think it's important to learn to talk the language. In other words, when someone's asking you about pricing, you have to know your audience. Like, are you talking to a consumer, or to a distributor or to a restaurant or wine shop. Knowing a pricing structure is important. And, how did I learn that? I kind of learned it by doing it and teaching my staff how to do it. And so the price isn't the price. And if you're going to quote any price, just quote a suggested retail price, because that gives you the greatest flexibility on offering different tiers, a discounted price for whatever reason. You have to learn about warehousing and trucking and all of that stuff. And so there's a lot of costs that I think you need to pay attention to. When I started out, because I was based in Southern California, or South Central California more correctly, I felt that to get my wines accessible to distributors, I engaged a Napa Valley warehouse. I actually have several warehouses, but I felt that was really important to have access to distributor pickup. Sounds crazy, but and it's kind of what I do today. But the challenge then is to how to separate your inventory, because there's a cost of transportation to get it there, and there's a cost of warehousing it, and you don't want to move it around a lot. I'm trying to think a little bit about events. There's distributor events, trade tastings, and there are consumer events, and you have to really learn when to talk about pH and TA if someone cares about that, which you don't start out with that. I instruct my team not even to talk about this wine is barrel fermented. I want people to talk about the texture and the structure of wine and what foods it goes with because of its texture, and wines that they might be familiar with that are similar, like my wine. And so I would encourage people to expand your own palate and know who your competition is on a worldwide basis, because people are going to say, well, what do you think of this wine? Or how does your wine compare to that wine? And if you don't have answers, if you make up answers, you are quickly discovered, especially if they are smart, they will call you on the answer. So I think you need to be, I like people who can talk the language, but who know what they're talking about. For instance, the importance of filtration, the importance of fining, when you would choose to do one over the other, what natural wine means. What the difference between biodynamic, organic, and sustainable growing and winemaking is, because there are big differences. And I like to promote how in our sustainability program, we have a very important component of education of our farm workers, and we manage our riparian perimeter. And we monitor water usage. It's not just about the chemicals, which is restricted, but some chemicals can be used judiciously. It's all about the big picture. And so again, I like broad thinking and not just the one way. You should only buy my wine because I'm biodynamic and I have sheep in my who poop in my vineyard. That has goodness to it. And I try, everyone decides for themselves. I hate to be critical about the horn that you have to bury. Listen, if it works for you, then great. But I think everyone needs to know the choices and pick the ones that work. And I think me, like many of my peers, we care about the future. And so we care about an environment for our children. When you talk about sustainability, you need a sustainable business plan. I don't have heirs. And so, you have to think about the future of your property. I've always claimed that I'm, will likely sell at some point, and creating those relationships along the way is something you need to know how to do. If it's for your kids, get them involved early, and make them work at someone else's winery, because I think that's even a better place to learn. And like Tia, I think doing a little bit of everything is in different parts of the world will give you different mentor approaches. It's super important. And so you could love a person, but it's not, their way isn't the only way. Really. More to address your marketing question. I don't know. I think thinking about the details is important. Are you meeting someone in a park? Are you meeting in a 3-star restaurant? I tend to want to overdress to impress, but not inappropriately. I want respect, and I try to think again, what is appropriate for my audience. And remember, there's always going to be a mixed audience out there. So I never assume people know anything. So oftentimes I'll throw out some winemaking term and right after it give the definition, just so someone doesn't have to raise their hand and say, what does that mean, and embarrass themselves. So you have to learn technique to communicate. Seriously, I just and again, verbiage is, some words just sound wrong or are bad, or, but again, things have changed. Some people will say, this is a badass wine. And I might say, this is a rock star wine. Or you might say, this is a, knock you on your feet wine. Or then there's the one that will say it's got, fine tannins and good acidity, and, and, there's just a time and a place that you want to share all of it. And part of it is, what's your time frame? So I always tell people, you have to sort of, what is your presentation? And I always tell people when they're presenting the wine, you want engagement. You want to tell people something that they didn't just read, that they came to the table and knew about, that they, you might talk about what the logo means. I like visuals. I tell people always have the bottle of wine in your hand when you're presenting it. So there's a visual attraction. Just one other note, one of the things I had to learn, this was my old label. Let's see if I can do that right there. And in probably, 2012, I was prompted to do a label change. So I don't know if you can see that I sort of changed my logo for my estate wine. Stay right there for 1 second. But I had an issue with visibility in a dark restaurant. And so this label tended to be more legible and pop on the shelf. I tend to have different wine names that I think are really important. And so, you need a story. And so I remember when I was looking for what should I call my winery. I made 2 vintages, 89 and 90. And then I had to say, what am I going to call this? And I remember I told a woman that I went to graduate school with, I told her it was going to be a Fiddlehead. And she said, that's a terrible name. You should change it. And of course, I had just spent 2 years polling everyone. And I felt like I hit on the right one, because my story was that It's actually named for the coiled frond of a fern, the tip of a fern. And it sort of fed into my scientific background, taking botany. And I was actually gardening in a fern bed when I went, that's it. I was so excited. But it's very melodic and memorable. And it's actually considered a delicacy in food. So the food and wine combination. And you know, a lot of people think that it's associated with the fiddle, which gets back to that botanical term. So it creates a connection because people say, oh, do you play the fiddle? And so after many years of saying, no, it's not musical or music related, I then created one of my wine clubs and called it Stradivarius Club, just as a play on the whole concept. It's how my brand just evolved. So naming a brand is difficult. There are trends. I have some place names like 728 and Oldsville being the road off of which Yamhill Valley Vineyards was located. And in fact, I made my first 15 vintages of my Oregon wine in Oregon. But when I built my winery, I learned that with refrigerated trucks, I could very comfortably transport fruit, but my requirement to myself was to be on site to decide when I was going to harvest and also to supervise the harvesting, which sometimes was a different time. So my participation at the growing level didn't change, but where I was processing, I could then process at my own facility with my own equipment on my own time and keep me in one place throughout the year, which was a better management tool of my wines. So again, that was a process of how am I going to do this? So anyway.
I'm a little surprised you didn't just learn the fiddle so you could say, yes, that is because of the fiddle. It seems like something you would do. You would just like, yeah, of course, I play the fiddle.
No, I would not be so bold, but I did have, my vineyard is located at a very specific mile marker. It's mile marker 7.28 on Santa Rosa Road. So one of my estate wines is called 728, and then we created an event called Drink 728 on 728, and we created another event called Fiddle Fest. And so it was my opportunity to have fiddle players come and entertain because I wasn't going to do it, but you never lose the thread of what you're speaking to. That's part of the continuum. And so part of it is what other brand is going to do to promote it the way I do.
I'm curious about, and especially in the early days, getting that kind of logistical setup for yourself. So you knew where you were going to be, when you were going to be, and you were able to get all the things that mattered. How did you make that work? How did you must have had to sacrifice some things. You must have had to say, I don't need to be here for this, but I need to be here for this. So tell me about kind of how that scheduling came to be.
So of course it's changed over the years, and the first year my production was very small. I started by making 100 cases, but one of the things that got exciting was that I was able to introduce my wine to the buyer for the White House. So my first vintage, 89, went to the White House, and it was like, so I thought I'm on the right track. You know, it was an experiment to see, is my vat size right? And is my time on the skins right? And is my, bottling choices right? And so so my very first vintage was a Santa Barbara County wine. I actually transported barrels to a Napa facility because it was a little closer to the Davis office that I was maintaining. So that was the first 2 years. But then when I was commuting between the two places, I knew that I had to be on site for things like shoot thinning and fruit thinning and leaf pulling. You decide like what's important to you. So your crop level and your crop exposure, and even as you get closer to harvest, netting, are the birds attacking your fruit, and can you do something about it? So as I mentioned, things happened a little later in Oregon, so that the timing was off or separated by about a month. So I could commute between the two places and then become a full-time resident during an expanded harvest. I'd be in Oregon maybe, I don't know, 6 weeks full-time for just making Pinot Noir from one vineyard. That's a fairly broad time frame, but I was working with a variety of clones, and I did not want to pick them at the same time if they did not ripen at the same time. So those kinds of decisions had to be made. I did successfully maintain an office in Davis, which allowed me to drive up to the Chehalem Mountains or fly up. It depended on, do I need my truck or not? Southwest was great between Sacramento and Portland. And the thing to keep in mind is, as a small business, I could call on restaurants along the way, whether I was driving or landing in Portland. You could use the opportunity to create and call on accounts. So when I'm driving long distances, I do a lot of planning now with, mobile phones. I can set up appointments and answer questions on my truck. But it's not an easy life, and you have to be somewhat organized. And, I was pretty much by the book. In other words, I always filed reports and got label approval, and there's different ways you can bend the rules. And it's not that I didn't never do that, but I tended to be more compliant more often than I would say many of the wineries that I see around me. So I think it's in my nature. I always talk about part of my brain being very artistic, and then the other part being very meticulous. And so having those active two parts has, I think, helped me manage making wine in distant places. I always said, if you can't do it yourself or don't have that talent, that you need to reach out and find someone else to do it, because when you try to do something you're not good at, it usually fails. But as a small person, I've had to learn about trademark law and reading of contracts and TTB requirements. And even during the pandemic, there have been licensing requirements to allow us to expand to an outdoor patio. I've had to figure out how to do that. And so my huge challenge, which I think you wanted to hear about at the beginning, is how much time to spend on doing any one thing, because of course you want to spend the time doing what you love, drinking wine with your buddies and customers, right? But there's so much more that you have to do. And so my big challenge is not only balance within the business, but with family too. I happen to have, my husband is also has a separate business, but I do this pretty much solo, so that I don't have a partner making management decisions. So that's a big challenge, but you always need to find time for your personal life, because I think that gives life balance that I may not be as good at as I would like to be.
The challenges of the solo entrepreneur, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, I just get thrills when people call at 8 o'clock at night and say, I just wanted to tell you I'm sitting here enjoying a bottle of your wine and it is so good. And the number of times that has happened over the years is so completely gratifying. When I talked about my label change very recently, yesterday, in fact, I had a customer who, because I like age on my wines, I just think they evolve into deliciousness. But it meant that when I bottled and labeled my wine and put them into the warehouse, they were labeled. And when I changed my labels, it meant I either had to wait several years to get the new label out there or soak labels off. And so to a select group, I actually incurred an added expense to retrieve the wine, soak off labels, reprint labels, relabel, and then send them out because I was eager to communicate this new look. But one of my customers was asking me about why he received the same wine with two labels because he purchased them at two different times on a re-release. And I'm always worried that they're going to tell me they like the old label better. But that's not what happened. This guy was so complimentary that it's that feel-good moment that you made some really good choices. And it's not all, you know, we will have failures, but you just have to learn quickly and not make the same failure. You know, what do you have to do to change it? And that is what I do all the time in my business. I will ask, what can we change so this won't happen again? Not whose fault is it? You know, blame someone, make them feel terrible, but rather, can we fix it or can we make it better? And what do we have to do so it doesn't happen again? And I think those are the important questions always be asking.
So you mentioned that you were from the beginning, you had a business plan, and your plan involved certain size, and your plan also involved certain varietals and in multiple places. So Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir are now, of course, very, very popular, much more so. But tell me about kind of being in on the early part of that, and were you ever concerned that the popularity wouldn't be there, that the marketability wouldn't be there? And how have you seen kind of that shift since you've started making and selling those wines?
Great question. Yeah, I wanted to make those varieties because they were not mainstream. It was more interesting and more exciting and more challenging, but I think of myself also as an educator. And so convincing people to change their minds is a wonderful challenge. And someone who tastes a bad Pinot Noir is reluctant to try another one. And so you have to kind of find a way to encourage a changed behavior. So I felt like it was a great focus. I felt that it was very doable. I'm not sure I would have guessed these wines would have become as mainstream as they are, which is great, good and bad. It means I created more competition for myself. And hence, one of the reasons I planted Grüner Veltliner out at my property, because it is a lesser known variety that people assume is sweet because it's in a hock bottle, which mine are not. And so it's kind of an expansion of the early years of why I did what I did. Now, I'm making a little less wine. My brand kind of settled in around 4,000 cases because that was a comfortable place for me to manage all the things that I needed to manage. And well, I can't remember the rest of the question. Sorry.
Totally fine. It was a lot of question. I'm sort of curious just about, you know, if you ever doubted your decision to go with those varietals, and then as
No.
you've seen them, as you've seen.
Nope, never. And I love the question, like, why did you pick, aren't those funny varieties to go together? Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir. And in fact, because one is sort of Bordeaux based and one is Burgundy based. And I said, what's the difference with Cab and Chart? When you think about it, it's identical, but nobody thinks that way. So again, it gives you conversation. But no, I never really doubted it, except, you know, now, because the vineyard is so large, and because of people's buying habits, as I think about, are there small blocks to be replanted, and what other varietal is appropriate with weather changes and with people's palate changes. And also, so, you know, I think for me, I'm always thinking, what would I do? And whether it happens or not, you know, things don't happen overnight. And there's a thinking about it, and then a researching it, and then actually doing it. And so I think my thoughts are whether I would do it to make it myself, which is unlikely, but I would do it more to sell to other people because of the saleability and the competition of you know, fruit that's planted in our area. That is a way to sort of make yourself different or stand out.
So you talked earlier about sort of coming into the industry and working at a lot of different places while you were being educated and all of that. And I think you mentioned early on kind of one of your main experiences. You were in the cellar with a bunch of men who'd been in the industry a long time. You were the young woman in a fairly male-dominated part of the industry. Tell me about that for you. Obviously, you were kind of ahead of your time in terms of the solo woman entrepreneur, making wine, working in the cellar. Tell me about your experience with that, the reaction of people around you as you told them you had this, you were going to have your own brand and make your own wine, and that, and how you've seen kind of that change as you've established yourself in the industry.
So it's a great question coming off of International Women's History Month, because it is so important, I think, for gender diversification in all businesses. And I think part of it, you know, what I observed was that women in general were funneled into the laboratory. This is when I was getting my start. Women, and in part because of the strength of women, people were concerned that how can they roll a barrel, or how can they move a pallet, or whatever. That's the production end. And of course, I never let that faze me at all, because I mean, again, you need to get the experience in a very broad scale. And just because most people are going into the lab, that is not, I actually never accepted a laboratory job because I already knew how to do that stuff. I mean, that was part of my education, but I did not know how to hook up a pump. And I didn't know how to, you know, screw on a clamp. And, you know, knowing about lees settling, and, you know, just some of the things that you look for. So I was very open-minded to be taught, but I also felt it was very important to let the people know you're working with that you are capable. So I am always proud to say that I don't need to lift that. I do it the smarter way. I let the tools and the equipment, a pallet jack is a better way to move something than heave it up. Or there's dollies for garbage cans and kegs. And there's a lot of tools that you can use to do a actually better job, to work smarter. You don't want to insult anybody, but I think you need to impress upon people that you are capable. And I wanted to be involved in everything. So you want people to teach you, and you want to put it into your pool of information, and decide what you like to do, and learn more of what you don't know how to do. The other important part is sort of the business part. That is, how do you learn the business? And part of it is working in the office end, learn the compliance. Some of the things I know, I just can't believe that I, have that wealth of information, and it's from doing it because I had to do it. And knowing all the different state compliance rules, and knowing about, gallon conversions to milliliter when you're weighing things out in the lab, or, creating DBAs, or, there's just so much. I used to teach at a community college the business of winemaking, and I had a 3-inch binder of the forms that you need to become familiar with. It may not be what you love doing, but you should just really know that they exist. But I started to say learning the business, not just the paper part, but also the banking. You need to learn about financial statements, and how, there's computer program choices that manage inventory. But you need to know how to read a balance sheet, and how to manage your cash flow, and, making your case, like when you go into a banker, on how you're going to support why what you're asking is a reasonable request. You have to kind of sell yourself on that front as well. So as a woman in the industry, I think I'm lucky in that, I did not let the fact that it's, people's comments deter me. I remember when I bought the ground for fiddlesticks, and the guy who's smoking the big fat cigar, who's running the D9, ripping the land, and he jumps off, and the vineyard manager introduces me as the patron, the owner of the property, and he wanted to know where my husband was. And I could have been very upset, but I found it was a smarter way not to let it faze me, and to talk more about what he was finding during ripping the big boulders in the property, than really feed an impression that wasn't important, really, when you get right down to it. Not to me or my success. So I think how you approach certain, there is a lot of discrimination that exists, but there is a way to manage certain things. And there's some things that are just terrible, and we still are fighting to change. High level positions in big wineries, those are, should have more women involved. And I think we're still trying to make that happen. But I think there's been much more embracing of women in the field, especially at the smaller level and small premium level. And no, I don't believe women necessarily have better palates. You get asked the same things all the time, you know. And
I was not going to ask you that. Just for the record, I was not going to ask about that.
we'll see if I need to withdraw it later.
You touched a little bit at the end of that answer about the changes you've seen for women in the industry. I'm curious now, for women getting into the industry, is it easier now? Are there more options available? What are the challenges that remain? And besides kind of the upper levels of the upper industry, what are the challenges that remain for women in the wine industry?
Well, I don't know. In part because I've well, let's see. I think we see, especially in Santa Barbara County, I don't know the numbers in Oregon, but we have at least half, if not more, women in the industry in winemaking positions. So, there's been a lot of inroads there. I don't know if it's a matter of for women or being a new winery to get your story out there, to get the people, the influencers to come and taste your brand and love you and believe in you, sometimes I think I should have hired a marketing person because I can't do it as often as I need to be doing it. And whether it comes off in this interview or not, I tend to get very shy, when I have to, in a big group of people I don't know, but, trying to get, say, a wine writer to come my way, I tend to be less aggressive. And in some sense, you need to, let people know you exist. Other challenges, I tend to think it's more for as a, new company, new business, new winemaker, than a woman starting out. I think opportunities might be a little bit easier. I mean, my graduating class, I think we had 10 women in the class, so there weren't a lot. Who knows on what the review system was like on who was getting in and who wasn't getting in. It might have been just subconscious decision making that guys were gonna, do a better job to make an impact on the industry. I really don't know that behind the scenes because it happens in plenty of other boardrooms, right? But I don't know. I think women can continue to excel by promoting our successes, and it's very natural to get a group together because it's interesting to, whether it's a group of winemakers or a group of women can help propel the position of women to a more equal basis. I think women tend to be a little bit more sharing of details and may help other women be successful, where in your exploring and how to grow your company, you may not get the same information from everybody. My challenges are more personal challenges and not, it's running a business, and I don't think of it as being sort of gender specific.
That's totally fair. I don't mean to have you as the representative of all women in the industry. Really just curious for your perspective. And I think that was a very interesting one. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I will say that my friendships are built around that sort of respect thing. And so I tend to have different conversations with men and women. And I kind of like the matter of fact conversations with men better. That's what gets me to where I want to be. So it's how you deal with people. Now, I don't know. It's a good question.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So I'm curious about your vineyard. We talked about Fiddlesticks a little bit today. Backing up to when you were deciding you wanted to buy a vineyard, tell me about finding the space you were looking for, what you were looking for in it, and kind of the potential you saw. And then tell me about, now that you had your own space for the first time, your own grapes for the first time, how did you want to farm them? How did you want to grow them? And has that changed at all in the years since?
Yeah, that question is really important, because really the question is, why didn't I buy land in Oregon, right? I mean, this is sort of the purpose of this conversation. And so I didn't necessarily plan to buy land, but as I mentioned, at one point, there was limited opportunity to buy grapes in Santa Barbara County. There were 3 big vineyards that were selling fruit. I was buying from one of them and it disappeared. And then the other 2 vineyards didn't have any additional quality fruit available for me. So if I was going to participate and pursue my business plan, I either needed to grow my own or pay exorbitant prices on some new developments. In Oregon, my access to fruit was a little bit different, and I loved the quality of fruit I was getting. I loved the opportunity of working with the grower on, growing for the wine and what collectively we thought was better. Not, it's always the winemaker that wants to spend more money and the grower that wants to grow more fruit, So you have to find balance, and owning both, helps you see the light. But, I felt that I really wanted to be making wines from both districts. And so because I still had access to Oregon grapes pretty readily, and I didn't in Santa Barbara, that was the reason I began my search for ground to grow grapes on. And I had actually been buying grapes from Santa Maria Valley, not the San Ynez Valley, of which Santa Rita Hills is part of. I kind of expanded my search by tasting wines from different areas that other people had made. And I had the opportunity to taste some of the very early 70s wine made by Richard Sanford off the Sanford and Benedict Vineyard. And it got me very excited because it was different from Santa Maria. And I kind of felt that would be an exciting direction to go, that these soils imparted spice and depth and some real ageability character into the wines with great acidity. And so I started limiting my search to the cool climate of San Ynez Valley, specifically on Santa Rosa Road. And so I found this gorgeous flower farm that was not on the market, that was in the right position and exposed, so I needed to go into this by minimizing my vulnerability. I needed to say, how will I more likely be successful? And I reasoned, well, the famous vineyard across the street is exposed to the same climate, has the same soils, gets the same rainfall, that might be a good way for me to go. So I made an offer on a property that wasn't actually on the market. It used to be a flower farm owned by an old Lompoc family called the Bodger family. And unfortunately, Santa Barbara County made this area a requirement to purchase minimum of 100-acre parcels. And I was only looking for 20 acres. And so it was a big step for me to decide to make the investment. And there is a lot of interesting history here that I'll only briefly go over, but originally I thought I would, so Fiddlehead Cellars is set up as a limited partnership. That was part of the learning curve. How am I going to do this? You can't even do a limited partnership anymore. Everyone's an LLC, but I'm an LP. And in fact, when the PPP loan funding came out, none of the forms could accommodate a limited partnership. So I had to jump through a lot of hoops because I've been in business for too long. But in any way, I decided I would try expanding the winery business to include the vineyard, and realize the vineyard is so big that the way I could operate more successfully would be to separate the vineyard into a separate business and look for a winery partner to share in half of the fruit, which is what I did. And it's a very unusual partnership because I'm a very small winery, but I partnered with a very big winery because they were the only ones that could afford it. But I wrote the business plan, the partnership agreement, so that it would benefit everything I wanted to do, which was to never have to compromise the growing, any growing decisions in order to accomplish what I wanted to for Fiddlehead. And also have the benefit of living on the property, and I am the manager, so I ultimately make all the decisions. But it became another part of my life that I never expected, which is to have to manage a whole vineyard and worry about selling grapes in order for Fiddlehead just to get grapes. So if I were to do it again, some days I wish I could have just found those 20 acres. And because my life, expanded to have to be involved in knowing about tractors and frost alarms and irrigation systems and it's all really interesting, and I super love it. And being a grower is fantastic, but on a large scale, we have to worry. A recent worry is, remember, we're in the cool, windy climate of the Santa Rita Hills, but we now have a cannabis neighbor that has a very strict requirement of chemical usage for like mildew sprays. And sometimes they're not always compatible. And so you have to worry about neighborhood relationships and county regulations. And so it's a big thing that's became on my plate. And it's, how can we make this work? Knowing that I had been around for, 25 years, and someone who moved in 4 months ago is leading my life. So sometimes I do think that, I never wanted to expand the quantity of the brand. I always wanted to stay small so I could stay involved. But that didn't quite happen on the vineyard end. But it's hard to make, the amount of time you have to put into it. It's hard to make the dollars work if you don't continually expand. So it's part of the business that you need to understand.
And you mentioned that part of that is that you're the manager of those 100 acres. So tell me about the farming practices then. From the beginning, were you focused on a certain type of farming practice?
Yeah.
That evolved?
So it's not just farming practices. It's, ultimately I have final approval of everything, and you have to decide what do you want to participate in to be part of the decision-making process. What are you going to rely on someone else for, and because of their expertise. And so I was pretty involved in sort of the development and the design work, like row direction and trellis type and, cross arms and end posts and clonal material. Then there were things that I knew less about, like the various nurseries. I actually planted, I chose to build and plant in phases. And one of the nurseries I used was an Oregon nursery for diversification. So one of the things that I didn't mention here that I used to talk about a lot is that by making wine in two places, that it broadens your access to things like suppliers or solutions to a common problem. And like a good punch down tool that was fabricated, could be a local supplier, but if you didn't have, several options, I have very different options that I have really enjoyed having. So planting questions and clonal material, all of that came from having access to two distinct places that are both trying to grow great Pinot Noir. Right? So there's key things that I want to be involved in. Pruning is one. Going way back, it's the training. What spacing are you going to have and why? And there's some logistical things. I remember my vineyard manager saying, we cannot go lower to the ground because I'm going to have lawsuits from our pickers with back injuries. And I mean, who would have thought that's a limitation? but insurance, it was a limitation. And so you have your wish list, and then you have your practical compromises that you have to make. And then, sometimes you just get input. For instance, the road direction from that very successful vineyard across the street was a due east-west vine row for no other reason than that was the way that it was done in the early 70s. And so I could benefit from making changes by learning from what they did, and trying to raise the bar by, being across the street, only with a better road direction. But so those decisions, I had to approve where to put in sprinklers for frost protection, where to invest in wind machines for frost protection. And then as your vines grow up, little things like, are you going to get milk cartons or plastic grow tubes? Are you going to get tall vines or the traditional vines? And, ultimately I'm the decider, but I try to gather information to help me make good decisions. Now it's important for me to be, as we fast forward to a mature vineyard, to be involved in different stages of the vineyard, like pruning, because in some places it was a good choice. We ran a little experiment and found it was a good choice to convert some of our cane train vines to a cordon system. But pruning for the selection of the right wood is really important. And not pushing vines to be what they're not, and when to replace vines. All of those things are important. Shoot thinning is important to me because it affects crop load and also distribution of fruit across the cane. Leaf tucking is important because there's shading, potential shading, breakage of canes that I worry about in a windy site. So part of living on the property helps me observe on a daily basis, but also if I'm traveling, there are key times that I want to be there. Leafing for fruit exposure is another big time that I want to be in the vineyard. And I usually want to be in the vineyard when we're counting our clusters, so I can sort of make an assessment of, we've always adjusted our crop. We've never pushed the vineyard to be what it can be, but rather reduced crop to be what we think will make quality wine. So that is, relates back to money again on our cost of farming. And then, of course, veraison and ripe fruit, watching the maturation process, looking for evenness of ripening, even from the time of bud break, which is one of the things I like to brag about at Fiddlesticks. And, down the vine route, it all looks the same, whether you go up a hill or no matter where you are. It's so important to ultimately having evenness in the fruit that you harvest. And then during harvest, of course, I like to, people tend to ask, when do you pick? They want to hear a bricks number. And I have found a way to share that there are probably 15 important parameters that you want to target in the vineyard, that you want to get as many as you can to make your harvest decision. So it could be brown seeds, it could be lignification, it could be, the lack of tendril growth, it could be the softening of the berry, it could be, there's so many things, and that if you, obviously flavor, that's probably number one. How could I miss that? And probably number 15 or 16 is bricks, which is important because of alcohol conversion. But, we have other tools, and also it's a balance. And I'm telling you, the more sugar you have, it will always taste delicious with more sugar. I mean, that's what table grapes are all about, but it's not always what makes a better wine grape. And so, recording all of those assessments over time help you to almost feel the assessment when you're in the vineyard. It becomes very natural. So I'm around a lot in both places, but also I have to say in Oregon, now with camera phones and, if someone is shoot thinning, you can take a picture and it can get to someone in, a second, and you can say, yeah, that's just what I'm looking for. So that there are ways to do remote things, except of course, taste the grapes.
Someday soon we'll have that too, I hope. You can just teleport those grapes to you.
I hope we never have that, because there are people who wanna, they want to measure the, 25 things in wine and say, let's just throw it to you. Okay. And so these are the things you can measure, and there's your good wine. Like, I just don't want to ever embrace that, ever. I'm still a romantic when it comes, taste it, feel it, think about it, all of that. Not it's a 12, you know, a 12 for this parameter and a 15 for this parameter. And so what do you think? Yeah, is it going to be good? I hope we do not go there, or Fiddlehead never goes there.
That's the artistic part of your brain talking, clearly.
Exactly. Right.
So earlier on, you talked about your wine making, and what you found important in wine was texture and structure. Tell me about developing that. And you mentioned Pinot Noir and Sauvignon Blanc both being similarly structured and textured. So tell me about developing that and what you're aiming for in a structure and texture in a wine of yours.
So one is that I was kind of lucky to inherit my mother's palate, who was actually a chef in her day, a home economist. And but I have a very sensitive palate. So that part is kind of easy for me, but part of this can be learned by doing tastings of components. And I always loved tastings that looked at low, high, and middle concentrations of things like alcohol and water, or acid, or tannins, and doing a lot of descriptive analysis. Not so much, it's part of a conversation, in part so you can communicate to buyers, but also so you can define what you like and what you're trying to achieve. So again, it goes back to, they don't have to all be the same, but if you can tie in something you're doing in the field with how something is tasting, which isn't always universally liked, it's sort of, what is your brand all about? Then it's important to be able to define those things. For me, everyone talks about a lot of buzzwords, balance, and balanced is a big one. And for me, balance is important. And what it means is that the intensity and concentration of the components are compatible with each other. So no one component overrides another one. So you don't want necessarily a certain TA. You want a TA that is in check with the pH and the fruit and the tannin structure. And so maybe the greatest thing that I learned is how to translate what happens in the vineyard to what happens in the wine. So you learn when to pick. Like, you learn that maybe when you start seeing a certain rate of increase of pH, that is going to maybe force you to do acidulations that you don't want to do. And as I mentioned, the higher sugars often taste good, but a very, in Pinot Noir especially, where the alcohol dominates. Alcohol also creates a certain weight to a wine. When you do these component tastings, you can learn that alcohol has viscosity and a sweet spot to it. So it isn't just because it's alcohol that might be perceived as a burn. It's the concentration of the alcohol in a particular wine and how all the components feed into it and around it. And so, my objectives are always, it's very interesting because Sauvignon Blanc's a good example. I make 3 distinct styles of Sauvignon Blanc. They're all made from grapes grown in Happy Canyon, AVA in the area officially known Happy Canyon of Santa Barbara. That's the official AVA, where I was buying grapes, 7 years before the appellation existed. A really cool, exciting spot. But what I learned is that because we have warm days, that the pyrazines, the thing that make the grape taste herbaceous or smell herbaceous, dissipate in this warmer environment. And with more advanced viticultural techniques that we use now, where we expose the clusters through different trellis systems and leaf pulling, that we also degrade the pyrazines. And so you end up with a grape flavor that's more based on a fruit flavor, peaches and pears and pineapple. And this particular district has that fog that rolls in that I mentioned earlier that helps retain acidity. So when it gets hot, it doesn't stay hot. And so you have these warm days and cool nights. So I love Sauvignon Blanc, but I learned that Bordeaux Sauvignon Blanc is very different from Sauvignon Blanc of the Loire Valley, and very different from New Zealand, say. And I tried to define, I like to think about, I have in my head where I want to end up, but I make the wine backwards. In other words, first you look at how do these people get this structure, how do these districts get their structure? What did they do? What is their winemaking technique? Is there anything else I should try? And so you end up doing a bunch of experiments and blends. And so I know where I want to end up, and sometimes copying, say, old world producer doesn't get me there, but it was a first step. So for example, I make a wine that is all stainless fermented, that is much more like a New World wine, more tropical flavors, bright, crisp acidity. But I always say that that alcohol level, which is, it's like 13, maybe a little under, but it adds viscosity to the wine. So you have weight on the mid palate. So I don't want the acid to be too sharp and too grippy. I want it to be add to the weight of the wine. Not heavy, but so all these wines are non-malolactic. So I look for texture that is kind of from the grape in the winemaking process, rather than introducing, a malolactic process. So the second wine is the opposite one, is all barrel fermented and selected from new oak, but very intentionally selected, like based on aromatics and how the oak tannins meld with the grape tannins. And so I'm looking for something that is a little more savory, definitely less fruity. And the perception of acidity is reduced, even though the reality is it's equal. So it is, the perception's reduced because of how the wine interacts with the oak. And I give this wine about 8 or 9 months in the barrel, but then I give it several years of bottle age to disguise the oak presence. And I mean, seriously, people say, is there any oak on this? And so it's all about the package, and that structure is very different from the stainless fermented. So the third one that I do is a combination, a hybrid, where it's about a third aged in stainless to get a certain fruit brightness and perception of acidity, and a third aged in new French oak to get the weight, but then a third is in neutral oak that kind of acts as a liaison between the extremes. And it reminds me more of a wine maybe out of the Loire Valley. It's it's a tamer wine. It's hugely versatile with all kinds of food because it's a very layered wine. And it's less domestic in appearance. You know, it's kind of has a little maybe French twist to it, is how I think about it. Same with so I call the stainless one gooseberry because of its brightness. It's not as extreme as a New Zealand wine, but that is commonly used to describe Sauvignon Blanc in New Zealand. And I call the barrel fermented one honeysuckle because it reminds me of the richness. And then I name the hybrid one after the district where the grapes are grown, so Happy Canyon, or the happy wine. Anyway, so when I talk about style and balance and structure and texture, that's a great example of how you can have different texture that's all balanced in different ways. And you can do the same thing with Pinot Noir. I mean, I do barrel select wines, but the barrels have to go together. You can't just pick a great barrel for one component. And that's what I try to do. My wine named after the mile marker needs to reflect the character of the place, but it has to be an assemblage of the wines made from that vintage that give it aromatics, mid-palate texture, and finish. And I probably give more importance to the finish because I think it's harder to achieve. Aromatics are easy. You ferment it cold, you give it new oak. But a wine that persists on the palate, that lingers on the palate, that makes you want to take that next sip, it's a much harder wine to make.
So I want to talk a little bit about Oregon now, and I'm curious about you mentioned kind of your initial impression. You got grapes here from Yamhill Valley in the early '90s. Tell me about your first impression of the grapes and the wines that were coming out of the Willamette Valley, and what made you so excited to pursue them, and also what you've seen change up here in the quality and the style and the time you've been working with Oregon grapes.
So one of the things that Stephen Carey did for me was he would present me with, cases of wines of some of the growers he represented. It was a way I could, expand my palate. And I was pretty excited about just learning all this new stuff and taste more wines. Remember, I was kind of in the heart of cab country at the time. And and then the other really exciting sort of opportunity was when I wanted to commit. It was easy to get Yamhill fruit, which was actually tough to work with. It was pretty tannic site. But being local, I was around in Oregon a lot, and it really helps you appreciate sort of the direction of vintages and meet the people and see what, there's a lot of friendships that were forged by just being in Oregon at that time. I'm sad when I moved my production, I could not stay in touch as much. And so a lot of the next generation, I'm just less familiar with. But a lot of the, growers from the 80s and 90s and 2000, early 2000s, I like, just good friends. And it gave me a chance to also kind of taste wines and learn about where I could experiment with fruit. And we're not talking about a lot of fruit, 2 to 5 tons maybe, or a couple tons here, a couple tons there, and expand. I never wanted to necessarily have the same conversation that I have with my Santa Barbara growers. It was about what I was seeing and tasting in Oregon and trying to learn that sweet spot on when to pick to make special wines. And I learned quickly when I used too much oak, or when I did too much extraction, or when I released too early. I mean, those were the kinds of things that I think my presence in Oregon assisted to drive better winemaking. And, you know, I had to make sure that I wasn't necessarily making my wines the same way as Yamhill Valley Vineyards, because, you know, I was using their equipment, and I just need to make sure I was making Fiddlehead wines on my terms. And I was grateful for that flexibility, very, very grateful. You know, I liked, you know, some vineyards I lost to other winemakers, as we mentioned earlier. And some vineyards I found were less appropriate for my blend, for what I wanted to do. And it was, as I mentioned, very exciting to cross paths with David Nemarnik, because sort of on one site, I was able to capture diversity and also have, you know, he was very accommodating on picking when I wanted to and sorting through the fruit as his pickers picked. And, you know, we did it a little bit differently than maybe he did it for his other people. And I continue to be, have always been, and will forever continue to hugely promote the success of the wines I could make in Oregon. Not to the exclusion of what I could also do in Santa Barbara. And I say that because one really is not better than the other. On the grand scheme, I really believe that. And I'm not sure enough people, you know, believe that, but that's why I'm here. You know, I try to promote that and encourage people to taste more Oregon wines if they only know a certain region. I think the wines, there's my observations over 25 years, I would say, 30 years, that there are more better winemakers. Now, I think that there's a greater pool of very high quality wines. And I think everybody's challenge is to make, you know, good quality, inexpensive wines. I think A to Z has done a really good job with that. And, you know, there's others. You know, the challenge and trying to restrict crop and trying to think like, who's your customer? What is your price point? Because there's huge demand for a lower price point of Pinot Noir. You know, people will drink a lot more of it. And so we don't want it to be a lower price point because we can't sell in the higher price point. We want to make a lower price point that is very delicious and has the transparency that we like about Pinot Noir, and the layers and the balance and the texture, you know. And Pinot Noir, the great thing about it is its transparency. It's easy for people to fall in love with it. And that's why, you know, I think balance is important. And because it's so transparent, the equipment we use and the skin contact and all of that matters a lot more than it does than other red varietals, for instance. There are certain techniques that I don't embrace. You know, it doesn't mean they're not right. It's just, for instance, the use of aeration techniques during winemaking. You know, air pulses and that I don't incorporate. But it's always, you know, if it's great for other people and helps wines, now I feel that where it used to be that we loved wines that aged a long time, the market demands early release of wines. So my big complaint is wines are released too early, meaning they're too fruity, or they're too acidic, or they're too disjointed. And I think there's been a push, and we have learned how to make better wines with early release. But I would say that's a big challenge right now, because I do not like a lot of really young wines because they're just not ready yet. So whether you're forced to release them early because of financial reasons, or because that's what everyone else is doing, or because the wine writer wants to review only those wines, which is another challenge, that I think that we need to learn more about that, to make wines that are released that don't taste like young. Yeah. And I hate aerators, so it has to be with the whole package of when we're picking, how long it's in barrel, all of that matters.
So what do you see for yourself as you look ahead now? We've talked a little bit about kind of the future for your business. What's next for you, and what are you kind of hoping for, looking forward to in the coming years?
Well, I think everyone's looking forward to getting out of the pandemic and socializing some, because our business is very social, and it's not the same when you do a Zoom tasting or a Zoom dinner. I mean, it really isn't. And you have to raise your hand to ask a question. So that's something on the horizon. We're in agriculture, so there's always forever evolving. There's better spray equipment that, we're working with that captures the spray and recycles the spray. I think that's, working with new tools is a great thing. I try to, share what I've learned with other new winemakers. So I try to get involved in education and consulting. I think those are good transitions for me. And part of it is, who the heck knows, because I really don't know what's on the horizon. But, I've always lived in a dynamic environment where sometimes something lands in my lap and it's a good idea. So, I'll tell you tomorrow.
I'm gonna call you every day and ask you what the future holds, and you can just keep telling me. All right, so last question for you. As you look back over what you've accomplished, is there something you're particularly proud of, a moment or an accomplishment that you look back on with kind of a fondness?
I think I try to remember the breadth and depth of the education that has come to me over the years. Even though I'm challenged every day, I think sometimes I shake my head because I know more than the truckers or I mean, sometimes I'm amazed at what has sunk into my brain, which is kind of fun. And I think the connection to my customers, the connection to being able to share a bottle of wine and tell stories and solve problems. I think that's a wonderful, greater purpose that I, look forward to doing in many, many years to come, when maybe I'm not making wine anymore. And so I don't know if it's that I get to enjoy the wines I've made or that I've learned what are like really great wines I want to enjoy. Don't have to be expensive. You know, I mean, the memories by tasting wine and by creating wine is something that I'm very proud of. And, you know, we didn't discuss how my brand has evolved. There's little, you know, special labels. My sister is an artist and I have an artist series that I love to share with people for the Grüner and my high-end Doyle. You know, I try to share a lot of my story on my website so that the people I can't talk to directly, they have resources and tools. But like I said, oftentimes it's me who's picking up the phone. So it's part of that I hope people will remember in me. There isn't one single wine that I want to say, oh my God, this went to the White House. And I did have an Oregon wine as well that went. And that's great. But ultimately, that isn't what I want to think is the feather in my cap. I think the camaraderie and relationships I've had over the years is what is most special for me.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. It's all the questions that I have for you. Obviously, we could keep talking forever and ever. This is great. But is there anything else that I didn't ask that I should have, or anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap this up?
Let's see. I think the only thing I didn't mention is that, you know, obviously the very early years I did this alone, but I do have some employees, and it's another challenge for me because I'm such a driven person that you know, there's always something to do, and I'm a pretty demanding employer. But I give a lot of credit to the assistance that I've been given over the years, and I'm appreciative, but at the same time regretful that I have, you know, my drive has you know, had to be part of their lives as well. And, you know, it's just maybe a good time for me to say thank you to everyone who's helped me along the way, taught me lessons, and helped me in all aspects of the business. I think my employees really should be given a giant thank you. And I hope in years to come, they get to hear that from me.
Fantastic. I love that. What a great way to wrap it up. That's really excellent. Thank you so much, Kathy. This was wonderful. It was great to talk to you and get your story. And we appreciate you being willing to sit with us for the project. We're gonna let you off the hook. If you want to hang around for a second, we can chat a little bit off camera if you still have a moment. But
yeah, let's do that. I really appreciate this opportunity, and my love for Oregon is emboldened by the fact that you reached out to me and can incorporate my participation into this history review. So thank you for that deeply.
You're very welcome. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. Thank you again.